On a quiet night when the world should have been at peace, the sound of injustice cut louder than sirens. It wasn't just the fire that tore through Judge Andre Colston's home. It was the hate that lit the match. Hate that wore a uniform. Hate that hid behind laws. Hate that claimed to protect but instead destroyed. For Andre, this wasn't the first time he had seen what prejudice could do. He had seen it in the eyes of officers who pulled him over for no reason, in the way authority twisted when a badge covered a heart poisoned with racism. But nothing compared to the night he realized that the evil he thought only lived in the streets had followed him home, carried by someone who believed her rules mattered more than his very existence. Judge Andre Colston was a respected figure, known for fairness and a steady hand in the courtroom. His name carried weight in the legal community, not because he sought attention, but because his record reflected integrity. Lawyers often said that if you ended up in Colston's courtroom, you could count on a ruling rooted in justice, not bias. He built his reputation through years of handling difficult cases with composure, never letting personal opinion cloud his decisions. His calm demeanor and precise language made him a figure both admired and feared, admired by those who sought fairness, feared by those who attempted to manipulate the system. But respect in the professional world didn't come overnight. Colston's journey began long before the robe and gavel. He had grown up in a modest household where hard work and perseverance were drilled into him by parents who believed education was the one weapon that could never be taken away. The lessons stuck, and as a young man, he pursued law with a single-minded focus. His early years in practice were not easy. He encountered discrimination, skepticism, and the kind of subtle resistance that black professionals often faced in predominantly white institutions. Yet he endured, driven by the idea that he not only represented himself, but also the generations of his family who had struggled for a place in society. By the time he was appointed to the bench, he carried with him more than knowledge of the law. He carried lived experience, an understanding of the struggles of ordinary people who came before him seeking justice. This made him a judge who was not just respected, but deeply trusted. Colleagues noted how he read every case file thoroughly, never dismissing even the smallest detail. To Andre, every case represented a life that could be altered forever by his ruling, and that responsibility weighed heavily on him. Inside the courtroom, he had a presence that commanded attention. He wasn't loud, but his voice carried an authority that made people stop talking and listen. Jurors leaned in when he explained the law. Attorneys sharpened their arguments, knowing that flimsy reasoning would not stand against his scrutiny. Defendants often looked at him with a mix of fear and hope, sensing that while he would not bend the law for anyone, he would also not deny them fairness. Andre was also known for his composure in the face of chaos. There were cases that spiraled into emotional outbursts, heated arguments, and even moments where safety seemed at risk. Yet Colston sat firm, his expression steady, his tone unshaken, reeling the room back into order with a few carefully chosen words. To him, losing control was never an option. If a judge could not maintain balance, then the scales of justice tipped into disarray. His reputation as the steady hand wasn't simply a phrase, it was a standard he lived up to every day, but the weight of such a role was not light. While others saw his authority as power, Colston knew it as responsibility. His nights were often sleepless, spent reviewing files, revisiting testimonies in his mind, and questioning whether he had missed something. He was human, and with humanity came doubt. Yet he never allowed that doubt to spill into his courtroom. For the public, he was the embodiment of confidence, the figure in black robes who seemed unshakable. Still, beneath the robe, he was more than a judge. He was a man who had built his life carefully, brick by brick. Outside the courthouse, he sought peace. Away from the bench, he was a family man, living quietly in a suburban neighborhood. After years of the city's rush and the courthouse tension, he wanted his family to have a sense of stability. He chose a neighborhood that promised safety, order, and community. The streets were lined with manicured lawns, children rode bikes in the cul-de-sac, and weekend cookouts brought neighbors together. For Andre, it was the kind of place where he could breathe. His home was more than a house, it was a retreat from the pressures of the legal world. Inside, the walls echoed with laughter from his children, the scent of his wife's cooking, and the quiet moments he cherished when sitting on the porch with a book in hand. He had planted trees in the backyard, watched them grow, and felt a sense of pride each time he pulled into the driveway. After years of facing the turbulence of criminal cases, the neighborhood gave him something precious, normalcy. Yet, even in this haven, he carried his discipline with him. Andre was not careless. He made sure the house was maintained, that the lawn stayed trimmed, and that his family respected the unspoken rules of suburban life. He valued the sense of order, not because it was required, but because order reflected peace. Still, unlike many around him, He didn't obsess over perfection. A slightly crooked mailbox or grass a little too long wasn't worth raising voices over, at least in his eyes. He also understood that life in a community meant differences. Neighbors would not always see eye to eye. Some wanted silence, others wanted gatherings. Some cared about appearances, others cared about freedom. Andre believed the balance lay in tolerance, in allowing space for people to be human without constant criticism. Despite his demanding work schedule, he made time for his neighbors. When community events were organized, he attended with his family, smiling warmly and speaking with those around him. Many appreciated having someone like him nearby, a man whose very presence seemed to bring reassurance, but there were others who viewed him differently. To some, his position as a judge made him stand apart, almost untouchable. They looked at him not as a neighbor, but as an authority figure, someone who naturally attracted both respect and resentment. Andre, however, tried to bridge that gap. He didn't flaunt his position. If anything, he downplayed it, preferring to be known as simply Andre, the man next door. What he didn't realize was that not everyone welcomed him in the same way. Beneath the surface of friendly waves and polite greetings, tensions were brewing. The very order he cherished would soon clash with someone else's vision of control. In his effort to build a life of peace, Andre had unknowingly stepped into a neighborhood where rules were enforced with suffocating intensity, and where those rules could become weapons. The home he thought of as sanctuary would soon become the focal point of conflict, and his role as a neighbor would prove far more complicated than his role as a judge. His home fell under the rule of a strict homeowners association, led by a woman named Karen Whitfield. The HOA, in theory, was supposed to maintain harmony in the neighborhood, ensuring that lawns stayed neat, houses were painted in approved colors, and no property fell into neglect that could bring down the area's value. But under Karen's leadership, the HOA didn't feel like a system of community care, it felt more like a dictatorship. She was the kind of person who knew every line of the HOA manual by heart and wielded it as if it were law. To Karen, every blade of grass, every trash can, every holiday decoration was an opportunity to assert her authority. From the moment she assumed her role, residents knew the atmosphere had changed. The prior HOA president had been firm but understanding, using rules as guidelines rather than weapons. Karen, however, treated those same rules as absolutes, demanding compliance without question. Neighbors whispered about her constant patrols. She would walk the streets in the evening, clipboard in hand, noting infractions with the seriousness of a police officer gathering evidence. It wasn't long before Andre found himself on her radar. At first it was subtle, a reminder notice about trimming hedges, even though his hedges were trimmed, a warning about keeping his garage door closed, even though it had only been left open briefly while unloading groceries. Andre, accustomed to weighing evidence and making judgments, saw the flaws in her claims, but decided not to make a fuss. He thought of it as part of living in a community. Sometimes you had to let small things go. But Karen wasn't simply enforcing rules, she was testing boundaries. Every time Andre dismissed her warnings with calm indifference, she escalated. The HOA letters became more frequent, often citing violations so minor they seemed absurd. One morning, Andre found a notice taped to his front door about his trash bins. According to Karen, leaving them at the curb past 10 a.m., the day after pickup was a violation. He had brought them in at 10:15 minutes had become grounds for official reprimand. Andre chuckled when he first read it, shaking his head at the pettiness, but his wife frowned. "She's targeting us," she whispered. Andre didn't want to believe it. He had spent his entire career weighing the seriousness of intent, and it seemed impossible to him that anyone would expend so much energy on something so trivial. Yet the notices kept coming. Neighbors began to take notice too. At block parties and evening chats, people muttered about Karen's rigidity. Some shared their own experiences, how she had fined a family for leaving a child's bicycle on the lawn overnight, or how she had threatened legal action over a mailbox painted slightly off shade from the approved palette. But with Andre, it seemed different. Her scrutiny was sharper, her tone more accusatory. Karen was notorious for enforcing rules with an iron fist, everything from lawn lengths to mailbox colors. For her, these weren't just community guidelines, they were proof of control. She equated order with power, and every violation became an opportunity to showcase her dominance. To her, a yard with grass an inch too long wasn't just untidy, it was an insult to the system she embodied. A mailbox painted a shade darker than approved wasn't merely a color choice, it was rebellion, and rebellion had to be crushed. Her obsession went beyond what most neighbors could tolerate. People joked that she must spend her evenings with a ruler, measuring lawns by flashlight. But those jokes carried unease, because everyone knew she wasn't acting out of love for the community. She was acting out of something harsher. Control was her lifeblood, and she seemed to take personal offense when anyone, especially Andre, didn't bend under her watchful eye. Andre's background as a judge made him stand out. He wasn't the type to bow his head to unreasonable authority, and perhaps Karen sensed that, when she saw him dismiss her warnings with a polite smile or ignore her petty accusations, it likely fueled her resentment. To Karen, compliance meant victory, and Andre's calm refusal to be rattled meant she was losing ground. She didn't want neighbors, she wanted subjects. It reached the point where Karen was no longer just enforcing rules, she was inventing them. One day, she confronted Andre about the shade of curtains in his front windows, insisting they didn't match the community aesthetic. There was no such clause in the HOA bylaws, but she argued with such conviction that a less knowledgeable homeowner might have believed her. Andre, well versed in law, calmly reminded her that fabric inside his home wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. Karen's face flushed red, her lips tightening in a way that made it clear she wasn't used to being challenged. From then on, the conflict sharpened. What had started as minor notices became personal confrontations. She would approach Andre's property during her evening patrols, standing a little too long on the sidewalk, peering at his home as though searching for imperfections. Neighbors began to whisper that Karen had developed an unusual fixation on him. Some dismissed it as her usual overzealousness, but others sensed something deeper. Andre's wife grew uneasy. She noticed how Karen's complaints often came with a tone that carried more than annoyance, it carried disdain. Subtle comments, clipped words, an undercurrent that suggested it wasn't just about rules, it was about who was living inside that house. She told Andre she believed Karen's behavior wasn't random but rooted in prejudice. Andre, ever the man of reason, resisted the idea at first. He wanted to believe he was being targeted simply because Karen was a control-obsessed president, not because of the color of his skin. But the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. As weeks passed, Karen's reputation in the neighborhood solidified. People avoided her, lowering their voices when she passed. Some even changed the way they lived, keeping lights dimmer at night, bringing in toys and furniture early, all to avoid her constant scrutiny. But Andre couldn't, and wouldn't, bend his life around her obsessions. He wasn't careless, but neither was he willing to let a woman's thirst for authority dictate his family's peace. What he didn't know was that Karen saw his calmness not as strength, but as defiance, and defiance in her eyes demanded punishment. Andre tried to remain neutral, but tensions grew when Karen began targeting him specifically. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. Maybe she happened to be patrolling at the times he left the garbage cans out a little longer. Maybe her notes about his grass being half an inch too tall were simply part of her rigid approach with everyone. But as weeks turned into months, the frequency of her complaints became impossible to ignore. It was no longer occasional notices tucked discreetly into his mailbox. It was a steady stream of accusations delivered with an almost personal sting. Andre had seen plenty of people like Karen in his courtroom. Individuals who needed to control others to mask their own insecurities, people who thrived on the power of enforcement rather than the spirit of fairness. But seeing it unfold in his own neighborhood was different. This wasn't a professional setting where he could set boundaries with his authority as judge. This was his home, his refuge, the place where he should have been free from scrutiny. And yet each time Karen sent a notice or knocked at his door, it felt like she was dragging the tension of the courtroom into his front yard. He tried to brush it off for the sake of his family. His wife, however, grew increasingly anxious. She noticed the way Karen seemed to linger near their property, arms folded, eyes sharp as though waiting for the smallest misstep. His children, too, picked up on the unease. One evening, his daughter asked why the neighborhood lady always frowned at their house. Andre reassured her, telling her it was just neighborhood rules, nothing to worry about. But inside, he began to sense something more sinister. Karen's behavior took on an unmistakable pattern. While she issued citations to others in the neighborhood, they were sporadic, often accompanied by apologies or explanations. With Andre, there were no apologies, only accusations. A basketball hoop left at the curb overnight resulted in a formal letter. A single weed poking up through the edge of his driveway turned into a written warning. When he hung a seasonal wreath that didn't match the HOA-approved list of holiday decorations, Karen made a scene in front of neighbors, her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac as she insisted he was lowering the community standard. Each incident chipped away at the calm facade Andre tried to maintain. In the courtroom, he was trained to stay composed no matter how outrageous the argument. At home it was different. He wasn't just a judge, he was a father and husband trying to provide a safe, peaceful environment. And now that environment was under siege, not from criminals or chaos outside the law, but from a neighbor who seemed intent on making his life unbearable. Still, Andre resisted the urge to retaliate. He filed each notice carefully, documenting them as though they were evidence, Part of him thought that one day he might need them. Another part of him believed that if he maintained dignity and refused to be provoked, Karen would eventually tire of her campaign. But what he underestimated was the persistence of someone fueled by obsession. She cited him for violations as minor as leaving his trash cans out too long. It was one of those moments where the absurdity of the situation clashed with the seriousness of her demeanor. One morning, after a long night preparing for a complicated trial, Andre overslept. The trash company had come early, and the bins remained at the curb longer than usual. By the time he wheeled them back, it was already late morning. That evening, taped neatly to his front door, was a formal notice of violation. The wording was sharp, almost gleeful in its precision. Failure to comply with the community guidelines regarding trash receptacle removal, resulting in visual obstruction and diminished neighborhood appearance. Andre read the letter twice, unable to stop himself from shaking his head in disbelief. It wasn't the fact that she had issued the notice, it was the energy behind it, as if she had been waiting for him to slip, prowling the street with anticipation. When he brought the notice inside, his wife grew frustrated. "This isn't about trash cans," she said, her voice edged with worry. "She's looking for reasons, any reasons." Andre knew she was right. 15 minutes of delay couldn't reasonably warrant a formal complaint, but for Karen, it wasn't about the bins, it was about control, and the fact that he, a man of authority in his professional life, didn't bow to her petty enforcement made him her prime target. The trash can incident became a turning point. It revealed to Andre just how far she was willing to go to enforce her will. It wasn't enough for her to keep the community neat. She needed to remind him over and over that in this neighborhood she held the power, and if he dared to resist, she would find ways to tighten her grip. Neighbors began to notice the imbalance. Some whispered support, telling him quietly that they too thought Karen was going too far. But few dared to confront her directly. She had created an atmosphere of intimidation, where speaking out could result in one's own sudden flood of violations. People preferred silence to becoming her next target. This left Andre increasingly isolated in his conflict, facing a woman who seemed to draw energy from confrontation. The tension even bled into his daily routine. Each morning as he left for the courthouse, he scanned the street, half expecting to see Karen's figure with her clipboard, eyes tracking his every move. Each evening returning home, he braced himself for the possibility of another letter taped to the door or slipped under the mat. The neighborhood that once represented peace now felt like a chessboard where every step was being monitored. For Andre, who had spent years confronting injustice in the legal system, it was a strange reversal. Inside the courthouse, he could issue rulings, establish order, and ensure fairness. At home, he was powerless against a woman whose authority came not from law, but from her own determination to dominate. He wondered how long he could ignore the harassment before it escalated into something worse, and though he tried to keep that worry to himself, deep down, he knew Karen's fixation on him was not a phase that would simply pass. What began as petty grievances escalated into harassment and thinly veiled hostility. The tone of Karen's letters shifted from cold formality to something more pointed, almost mocking, as if she relished finding flaws in Andre's life. Neighbors noticed how often she singled him out, sometimes walking directly up his driveway with that clipboard in hand, scribbling notes while pretending to check her watch. It wasn't the kind of enforcement that came from duty anymore. It was targeted, relentless, and increasingly personal. Andre tried to rationalize it, telling himself she was just one of those people who needed control, but even he could feel the shift. There was an edge to her behavior that suggested her motive went beyond neighborhood rules. Neighbors whispered about Karen's prejudice and how she seemed especially harsh toward homeowners of color. Whispers became quiet conversations at backyard fences, exchanged with cautious glances to make sure she wasn't nearby. Stories trickled out, how she fined a Latino family for having too many relatives visiting during the holidays, how she scolded a black teenager for playing music in his own driveway, how she once told an Asian couple their decorative lanterns didn't fit the look of the neighborhood. The pattern was too obvious for people to ignore, yet most stayed silent out of fear of retaliation. For Andre and his family, though, the hostility was undeniable. Karen's watchful eyes and sudden appearances felt less like neighborhood oversight and more like surveillance, her fixation carrying the weight of something darker than simple rule enforcement. Andre dismissed it as neighborhood drama until things turned dangerous. He had grown used to Karen's constant nitpicking, her letters, her confrontations, but he never truly believed she would cross a line beyond harassment. That belief shattered the night he noticed footprints in the damp soil near his porch, far too close to the windows for comfort. A chill ran through him, not from the marks themselves, but from the realization that someone had been watching. One night, in the dead of silence, flames erupted across Andre's property. The blaze spread quickly, fueled by accelerants later discovered at the scene, turning the home that had been his sanctuary into a furnace of destruction. The roar of fire consumed the night air, windows shattering, smoke curling into the sky as neighbors rushed from their houses in disbelief. Sirens cut through the chaos as firefighters battled the inferno, but the damage was already beyond control, the house collapsing into glowing embers while Andre and his family stood helpless in the street. By the time firefighters arrived, his house was engulfed in fire. The glow of the flames lit up the entire street, turning the calm suburban neighborhood into a scene of chaos. Smoke billowed into the night sky, thick and suffocating, spilling over rooftops and drifting far beyond the cul-de-sac. The sound of shattering glass rang out as windows imploded from the intense heat, sending shards scattering across the lawn. The fire crackled with a roar that overpowered voices, leaving only the frantic wail of sirens and the shouts of firefighters barking orders to one another. Neighbors spilled onto their driveways, their faces pale in the orange light, some clutching phones, others holding their children close. The disbelief was palpable. This was the kind of destruction they saw on the evening news, not something that belonged in their quiet community. Yet there it was, raging in front of them, consuming the home of the man they knew as the steady, calm judge who had always kept his composure. For Andre, those moments stretched into a blur. He remembered standing on the street, barefoot in his pajamas, his heart hammering as he clutched his son's shoulder, scanning to make sure his entire family was safe. He could feel the heat searing his skin even from a distance, and every second the fire grew, it seemed to devour another piece of his life. The living room where his children had once sprawled on the rug to watch movies was gone in minutes, swallowed by flames that leapt up the walls like they had been waiting for the chance. The study where he kept his law books and the notes of his earliest cases collapsed in a burst of sparks. The family photos, the heirlooms passed down from his parents, the letters from his law school days, all of it was reduced to ash before his eyes. He could do nothing but watch, helpless, as the fire stripped him of the tangible markers of his past and present. Firefighters rushed in with hoses, their silhouettes outlined against the inferno, battling to contain the spread before it reached the neighboring houses. They shouted commands over the roar, working with urgency, but the fire had taken too strong a hold. The walls buckled, beams groaned under the weight of collapse, and with a sickening crack, part of the roof caved inward. A rush of sparks and flames shot skyward as the structure gave way, drawing gasps from the crowd of neighbors gathered in stunned silence. Some people covered their mouths, others shook their heads, but none could pull their eyes away. They were watching the destruction of a man's life unfold in real time, and it was almost too much to comprehend. Through the haze, Andre noticed the reflection of the fire in his wife's eyes, wide and glistening with tears she couldn't stop. She clutched their daughter tightly, whispering reassurances that trembled with fear. His son stood stiff beside him, fists clenched, jaw tight, the kind of silent anger only a teenager could hold when faced with something unfair and senseless. Andre tried to be the anchor for them, but inside he felt unmoored. He had stood in courtrooms where people's freedom and futures hung in the balance, and even then, he had never felt so powerless. The robe, the gavel, the years of authority, all of it meant nothing here. He was just a man watching his home die. The fire chief approached him once the blaze was mostly under control, sweat streaking through the soot on his face. His expression was grim, the kind of look that spoke louder than any words could. He placed a hand on Andre's shoulder, not as a formality, but as a gesture of human compassion. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "We saved what we could, but—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Andre already knew. The home that had once been his sanctuary was nothing but a charred skeleton, its frame smoldering, collapsing piece by piece. In the hours that followed, the scene settled into a quieter kind of devastation. Firefighters packed up their hoses, leaving behind puddles that reflected the eerie glow of dying embers. Police cordoned off the area, snapping photos, collecting statements, beginning the process of turning tragedy into a case file. Neighbors offered blankets, coffee, soft words of comfort that barely registered in Andre's ears. He nodded, thanked them, but his mind was elsewhere, still inside that house, wandering through rooms that no longer existed. Miraculously, Andre and his family escaped alive, but everything they owned was destroyed. When daylight finally broke, the full extent of the loss became clear. The house stood blackened and hollow, smoke curling lazily from the ruins. The porch where he had once sat with his morning coffee was reduced to rubble. The oak dining table, scarred from years of family meals and homework assignments, was gone. The piano his wife had inherited from her mother was nothing but a warped, unrecognizable frame. Even the walls that had been painted with care when they first moved in were stripped bare, charred into fragments that crumbled at the touch. The sight was almost unbearable. He walked slowly through what little remained, guided by an investigator who cautioned him not to step on unstable ground. Each step was like reopening a wound. He spotted the twisted metal of what had once been his daughter's bicycle, the scorched frame of a bookshelf that had held his father's Bible, the cracked fragments of a photo frame that had displayed his wedding picture. These weren't just objects, they were chapters of his life, reminders of moments that had shaped him, now reduced to debris scattered across the ashes. His neighbors watched quietly as he moved through the wreckage, some of them holding back tears of their own. They had seen his family grow, shared block parties and school runs, borrowed sugar and offered holiday cookies. For them, the destruction wasn't just about a house, it was about a man and a family who had been cornerstones of the neighborhood. To see them stripped of everything struck deeply, shaking the illusion of safety that the community had wrapped itself in. Andre's children clung close to him, their faces etched with confusion and grief. His son asked where they would sleep, his daughter asked if her toys were really gone. Questions with answers too heavy for their age, answers Andre himself didn't fully know. He crouched down, gathering them into his arms, whispering that they still had each other, even as he struggled to believe the words. His wife stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm with a strength that told him she wouldn't let him fall apart. In that moment, he realized that while the fire had taken nearly everything material, it hadn't taken them. Still, the emptiness gnawed at him. The house had been more than walls and a roof. It had been a place of laughter, of warmth, of belonging. It was where he had returned after long days in court, where he had celebrated birthdays, where he had sat in silence with his wife when words weren't needed. It was the foundation of his family's sense of stability, and now it was gone. As he stood amid the ruins, the weight of loss pressed down on him with a force he had never known, leaving him with the haunting realization that some fires burn far deeper than the flames reveal. The trial became more than a fight for justice. It turned into a reckoning for the entire community. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet now faced the uncomfortable truth that silence had allowed Karen's behavior to spiral unchecked. They watched as the courtroom laid bare not only the crime but the prejudice and obsession that fueled it, realizing that looking the other way had its own consequences. For Andre, the case was deeply personal yet symbolic, a reminder that hate can thrive in ordinary places, behind trimmed hedges and friendly waves, until it erupts into something devastating. The verdict, whatever it would be, carried weight far beyond one man's loss, speaking to accountability and the need to confront the darkness people often ignore. The flames died and the verdict was spoken. The truth still burned hotter than any fire. Hate wears many faces. Sometimes it hides in the neighbor who smiles in daylight, but seethes in the dark. And sometimes it wears a badge and a gun, cloaked in authority yet poisoned by racism. For Andre, this story was never just about a house or a courtroom. It was about a lifetime of battles against a system that too often looks the other way, when prejudice takes power. The question that lingers is one for all of us. How many lives must be scarred? How many homes reduced to ash before we stop excusing hate in uniform, hate in rules, hate in silence? Because until that day comes, men like Andre will keep standing in the fire, waiting for justice to mean more than words.